Yes, here today I'm talking about the general state of web accessibility, what we can hopefully do to make it better, and create more empathy in our teams. I am Callum. I'm a Senior Accessibility Specialist for the Government Digital Service. You can find me at callumryan.com, also on Blue Sky. My work day-to-day is working on the GovUK website, helping to make it more accessible and also improve the capabilities in our teams. GovUK has millions of people visiting every day, doing everything from renewing tax on their vehicle to applying for a passport. So yeah, it's pretty much my job to make sure that things are more accessible for them. Now, a bit more personally, I am on the autism spectrum, based in London. I particularly like trains, particularly accessible trains. Here in the picture we have an accessible Swiss train design with platform ledge extruding from the train's red coloured door. So how accessible is the web in 2025? Let's step away back from digital accessibility and look at accessibility overall. Well, the picture we see here is a staircase leading up to a doorway, and unfortunately, if we look at the overall landscape of accessibility, this is a very common sad picture that we see of the state of accessibility, not just within the digital context. Similarly for our transport, how we get around, and unfortunately here, so we see a disabled user trying to access a bus with the steps far too high. And we can learn a lot from this and think about how accessible the web is in 2025, to think about those contexts and how that can maybe change our thoughts on making things more accessible. To start with, the legal landscape, which often we lean against, to think about how we can apply more accessibility into our law. The laws have evolved over the past few years to some extent to strengthen protections against discrimination, ensuring people with disabilities have more equal access to digital products and services. Now, depending on your location, this can differ in terms of the laws, in terms of compliance with particular guidelines, things which maybe bring about imprisonment, even having fines, mandated accessibility improvements. And those are the consequences of not complying. And the result is, we'd hope, more progress in digital accessibility, which in some cases is improved, but in many cases it hasn't. A selection of places here with legal frameworks which attempt to address digital accessibility include the European Union, which you'll probably see in a few weeks' time, is bringing in the European Accessibility Act. And these are aimed at products and services to make sure that consumers have accessible access to services. Here in the UK, we have a particular regulation for public sector organisations, the Public Sector Bodies Accessibility Regulations 2018. And these again mandate particular websites and mobile apps must meet a baseline of WCAG, which is 2.2 single and AA standards. And as a broader context as well, thinking about things like the Equality Act, these things apply to not just public organisations, but private organisations as well. And we can see as well there, the USA have their section 508, which does also cover things beyond digital accessibility, as well as other countries increasingly bringing in their own laws and acts to hopefully bring about more compliance. Now, each year, WebAIM is one of many websites which conduct different types of surveys to try and gather some share findings about general web accessibility. And in their most recent survey, around 95% of homepages had detected WCAG 2 failures. If anyone familiar with WCAG 2.2, this is a set of 87 success criteria which help ensure that our websites are designed to work for everyone. In this example, can anybody see the text on the slide there? I certainly can't. If we try to improve that a bit, maybe you now can see a little clearer. Around 79% of homepages have low contrast text. Now, why does this matter? Around 2 million people in the UK have significant sight loss, and around 360,000 people are registered as visually impaired. Those sources from RNIB. And then thinking beyond that in terms of like lower vision impairments, visually impaired users such as color blindness, and these numbers again, around 1 in 12 men, that's around 8% of men in the UK, and 1 in 200 women have some level of color blindness. In the UK, approximately 3 million people are colorblind. So that's around 4.5% of the entire population. Here we have an image. The description here is a default placeholder image showing when an image is unavailable or hasn't downloaded. So around half of images don't have alternative text. Providing meaningful descriptions for images is essential for users who rely on screen readers. It's also for anybody who has difficulties in viewing or interpreting visual content. This includes those with severe vision impairments, cognitive disabilities, and also conditions that may affect people's perception of images. Here we have a popular e-commerce website. We've modified it to simulate what it's like for blind users and what's missing on this form. Quite clearly, we can see that the labels are not there. So around half of homepages surveyed had no input labels. That creates quite a significant accessibility barrier. Without clear labels, users, particularly those relying on screen readers, voice control, or assistive technology, struggle to understand the purpose of each field. The issue is often very frustrating, and particularly where there's errors in that form and the submission goes ahead, and you get these errors coming back. Overall, that can exclude users, particularly who depend on well-structured web forms, who need to navigate through a journey successfully in order to complete a process. Here we have a simulation pretty much of blind users' experience of what it's like to have empty links and empty buttons on a page. Again, around nearly half of the home pages surveyed didn't contain any text in the links, and around 30%, around a third, feature empty buttons. As a result of this, users, especially those relying on screen readers or voice control, will struggle to navigate between pages and determine the function of those buttons. Can anybody read Hebrew? So we have an example here, 15% of something within another language. Here I'm trying to simulate the experience of when we don't include the language tag correctly, or we use a different language tag than we are intending to present that language. And 15% of home pages miss completely a document language tag. In many cases, those language tags are wrong. And the language attribute, as we often refer to it in the technical sense, helps browsers and assistive technologies to actually interpret and present content in that correct language. Without this tag, screen readers often struggle to determine the intended language, and that can result in mispronunciation and reduced comprehension for users who rely on the correct language tag. So here we have a bit of code here. The div often used as a button, and so we have role button, area pressed equals not pressed, area label the next slide is about ARIA usage. And then within the text there, we have the next slide is about ARIA usage again, repeated. So what we're demonstrating here is that ARIA is often misused, and the misuse is increasing. It's gone up to around 18.5% just in 1 year. That rapid increase isn't necessarily a positive trend. Obviously, using ARIA, I often think, well, more ARIA might be the best thing, but often ARIA is causing more problems than it solves. And whilst we want ARIA to enhance accessibility of web pages, when we don't use it correctly, we use it excessively, ARIA turns from being a quick fix to something which ends up causing a lot more problems for particularly assistive technology users. And this can often lead to confusion for disabled users, and it can also be redundant information. So yeah, we need to really find a better way of using ARIA and to educate our teams as well to use ARIA in a better way. So what's not in the stats here? Well, there's a fair amount of things which we can't find through automated testing. Typically, these are things which the survey uses to cover its results. Whereas here we have a list of some things which can't be so easily identified, particularly things like lack of keyboard accessibility. And these are things which people often complain about when they're not able to access content if they're dependent on a keyboard. If the screen changes unexpectedly, if new information is displayed on the same page, for example, and they're not informed of that. Forms, again, think about how we structure forms, complex forms, can we make them simpler? Ambiguous link text. Obviously, we have lots of links and things can be like click here or go to the next step. Can we make those texts more meaningful? And another major issue as well is capture. Something which isn't picked up so easily, automated testing doesn't always. Capture creates a significant barrier as well for disabled users. Other considerations as well, think about site search. Often a website doesn't have any way to search through the content. It can be very difficult to navigate it other than just manually going through each page. So we do need to think about things like having a search which is functional and find you the content that you need to find. Now, it can't be reiterated enough that legal compliance is merely a baseline for addressing the needs of people with disability. We need to go beyond that and shift attitudes to recognize that good accessibility benefits everybody, while poor accessibility creates barriers for all. So now we're going to move on a bit more to talk about screen reader usage. And question I'm often asked is publicly available. What publicly available stats are there on screen readers? And my answer to that is that studies of its use are limited, and screen readers and other assistive technology like speech-based control are something which is, there's some ethical matters there, but primarily we don't want to be assuming what technology people are using, but thinking about the technology itself and whether we are making things accessible from the first point of design, rather than trying to design for specific technology. So again, we're looking at some stats here. Again, this only represents a small number of users, but it gives us a few indications about like the most experienced and advanced user of screen readers and what they use for their desktop and mobile devices. Overall, from these stats, we can see that NVDA and JAWS remain the most common. Globally, around 60 to 80%. Narrator comes around close fourth against VoiceOver, but these remain around 40% overall together. What's more important to look at is the stats, particularly around the combinations of screen readers and browsers that people use. So, for example, we can see that JAWS and Chrome are the most common. And in the past year or so, we also see that JAWS and NVDA appear to work the best with Chrome. And whilst VoiceOver is commonly used with Safari, we can see that those numbers are a lot lower. And that probably represents things like costs in terms of the hardware that people need to pay to get a Mac compared to Windows, and thinking about other things which we'll move on to in a moment about mobile as well. Screen readers commonly used on mobile. It's important to remember that some users don't even have a desktop. So you can see from this, around 90% of users do use a screen reader on their mobile device, whereas only around 8% don't. Typically, when performing daily tasks such as banking, shopping, mostly users will use an app. Around still 42% of users will go back to the web and do things there. So it's still important that we consider both app and website when focusing on accessibility for both the web and the apps. Now, the iOS operating system continues to dominate for mobile screen readers. The market there is around 75%, whilst Android is only around 25%. Do remind people that these are stats from more developed countries, so they may differ again, thinking about two countries where the incomes are lower, and potentially there might be some higher numbers for Android there. Now, there are a few other screen readers on mobile, particularly the usage besides VoiceOver on iOS and TalkBack on Android, which are still the highest of the primary screen readers on those devices. We do see some, not smaller numbers, but worthwhile looking at those as well, particularly like Voice Assistant and Voice View, which are on, I think, Voice View is on Android, and Voice Assistant is, I think it's again looking at iOS there. Now, something that we don't always think about so much, but in terms of the different types of screen reader users, blind users are quite predictably the highest users of screen readers. There's around 80% of users are blind users or visually impaired users as well, which is around 20%. There are most common types of users of screen readers, but there are a sizable number of others. So bear in mind that screen readers are also used by sighted users, and it's one of the often things I talk about with developers is that they need to think about things like hidden content for content which might be visible, might not be visible, sorry, for screen reader users, but there'll still be other users who need that content. And it can be problematic for users, particularly if they can see, they can hear the content being read out by a screen reader, but they can't actually see anything. And that is one consideration of why we shouldn't just think hide stuff for screen reader users only. Now, other assistive technology, particularly think about other technologies. Individuals with motor impairments or those with favour for hands-free interaction often rely on speech-based controls. Also, anybody who uses a voice assistant, such as Siri, will probably be familiar with this as well. So in short, there's a variety of assistive technology, including speech-based control, voice control, which is already included on Mac, iOS, and iPad, Dragon, or voice access for Windows. Voice access, I think it's the free version, whereas Dragon is a paid-for tool that you can use on Windows. And again, already built into Android, we have voice access, which you can use to test speech-based control there as well. AI does continue to be something which is seeing improvements, but at the same time, we see a lot of limitations, particularly with how the web works with AI, the problems and things we face with it in terms of usability, the research that's conducted with real users as well. So quite recently, we've seen some companies such as DQ, who are releasing their own AI-powered assistants, which hopefully in some positive ways will improve the way that we can improve our development process to be more informed about how to write accessible code. In this example, we have an assistant which helps you to put together a group of radio buttons in a group, and you can ask that assistant to help you write the right code, which will be more accessible. It's of course important that we do usability research, which is of a high standard, to really understand whether we are meeting the needs of real users. And I think we are at least some time off from AI even coming close to being an assistant for that, if not a complete replacement, which I'm not really hopeful myself on. Generative AI is another thing which has its uses. Generative AI can be used for things like alt text if it's done in a way which includes human review. It's essential that we ensure that accuracy and contextual relevance is meaningful. And that is one of the problems which generative AI can struggle with, certainly with a lot of the AI-based alt text generators right now. And I do recommend, if you have some time, to listen to another talk by Leonie Watson recently, which goes into a bit more detail about the progress in this area. So now let's talk a bit more about increases in disabilities. So overall, in the world, we are seeing an increase in disabilities, both diagnosed and undiagnosed. About 16% of the global population, that's around 1.3 billion people, experience significant disability. And this really does reinforce the case that we need better skills and capabilities in digital accessibility. Here in the UK, we have around 16.1 million disabled people. That's around 1 in 4 people. And working age adults, around 23% of working age adults are disabled, which then rises to nearly half the pension age of adults are disabled. And what does this mean? Well, disabled people, people who are assessed by the day-to-day activities as having a long-term physical or mental health condition or illness, which could be considered disabled. So what are attitudes to disability in general? Around 5 years ago, the digital agency Umbraad published the Digital Accessibility Report, which polled around 100 digital professionals. And their findings looked at the organizational barriers which businesses often neglect in accessibility. Now, the biggest barrier to accessibility is often a lack of ownership. People and skills, and this is often made all the more harder because of senior leadership, which are not convinced of the benefits. And there's bottom-up approach to advocacy for accessibility, which is often very hard to do when you don't have that senior leadership driving the change. So around 85% of organizations agree that businesses lose out when they do not meet digital accessibility needs. 73% of respondents did not know how much of the UK population has a condition or impairment. And around 82% of respondents don't know the spending power of disabled people. We often refer to this as the purple band, and it often describes significant spending power of disabled consumers and the financial opportunities associated with improving accessibility in products, services, and business practices. And around 65% of organizations don't test their digital accessibility with real customers. Often accessibility is considered an afterthought. So what can we do to improve? We can think about designing for inclusion from the start. Some of you might be familiar with this illustration from the Microsoft Inclusion Design Guide, which demonstrates some people with different types of impairments. That includes touch, see, hear, and speak. Each kind's demonstrated with permanent, temporary, and situational types of impairment. So we all experience impairments during our lives, whether this is situational, temporary, or permanent. And it's important that we look at this when we think about designing for inclusion. When we look at the organization culture, we need to embed accessibility. We need to actively recruit people with disabilities. And through doing this, we can ensure all aspects of our workplace, communication tools, and hiring processes are fully accessible. We need to do accessibility testing early on when possible with real users. Make sure that our workflow prioritizes accessibility with enough time to do comprehensive testing. Too often we don't allow that time to do accessibility testing. We just rush through it, or we don't do it at all. Most importantly, we look at the final stage result in terms of accessibility audits. That's often the way that we go and end up just focusing on accessibility audits as the only way of testing, and that's not sufficient. It's likely that the issues we uncover will be too late, meaning that remediation work is more complex, costly, and in many cases just ignored. So how can we find people with disabilities to test with? Test our products. We can look at different organizations, charities as well. Here we have a few. I recommend certainly looking at some of these. So we've got AbilityNet, some of the charities as well, ADHD UK. We can also use companies like Fable, who do particular testing with different users. We need to have more advocates of accessibility who focus that is more on education and awareness. Rather than relying on legal threats, vilifying those who may not yet understand its importance. Encouraging a positive and informed approach, it really helps to foster a meaningful change in organization. We need to advocate for accessibility as the logical choice for our teams, organizations, and question if it's not the logical choice, then why not? Now, grassroots efforts to improve accessibility, they often struggle. And really creating lasting change is something which does take a lot of work. Making sure that we have leadership buy-in, we secure that leadership buy-in is really important. Now, advocating for accessibility at leadership level is really also another consideration. We need to make sure that we have compelling data and real-world examples which we can go to leadership with and make the case for accessibility being the top of their priorities, and really be the voice of disabled users in our organizations. Something we should all strive to do and strive for our colleagues to do is to improve our empathy skills, observe and listen to people with disabilities, actively help build a deeper understanding of accessibility needs, whilst also improving our own empathy skills. Now, we have networks of people who do this every day, advocating accessibility, and I do recommend if you want to join, there is a Champions of Accessibility network on LinkedIn, and we have monthly online meetings, which provides a platform for everybody to share both success stories and discuss challenges in implementing accessibility strategies in their organizations. I do also recommend, here is a few examples. You can use the QR code if you want to scan that URL link, which has a list of all these links here. I recommend reading these articles. Certainly Fostering an Accessibility Culture is a great article I recently read about thinking about how we can actually bring about some change in our own organizations. Referring also back to the research and stats, which I was mentioning here, I recommend having a read through the Scope website. There they have some more details about that. Also, the Digital Accessibility Report, which goes into a bit more detail looking at companies or organizations and how they struggle to take on accessibility as being their main focus. Also, for looking at your job role and maybe other people's job roles, the DWP Accessibility Manual has an extensive list of best practices and responsibilities for each job role related to accessibility. Do definitely recommend using that as one of your bookmarks to refer to in your job. And as I say, there's a link there to join the Champions of Accessibility Network. Also, if you're looking to take on more training, maybe a bit more beyond just the compliance and the technical accessibility knowledge, maybe thinking about project management, a whole wide range of training courses, look at the hassle inclusion training there. thank you for your time. And if you do have any questions, do send me a message on my website. I have some links there to my email, and also I'm on Blue Sky.